What we saw at the end of chapter 4 in Daniel was that King Nebuchadnezzar turned from his ways and he finally recognizes that God is the most high God and that God is his God. And so we saw that turning of Nebuchadnezzar. Unfortunately, we now know that Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. And within 20 years of his death, the kingdom fell apart. This is how it went. After Nebuchadnezzar, his son served for 1 year, and then he was assassinated by his brother-in-law. Now, I hope none of that is true about modern day, that after a son takes over, that a year later a brother-in-law murders him. I hope there's no connection there. But that's what happened back there, okay? His brother-in-law assassinated him, and then that brother-in-law served for 4 years until his son took over for only 1 month. He was only in power for 1 month because there was this group of conspirators that were trying to gain access to the throne. You see, Babylon was huge and powerful, and remember, Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world, and so when he was gone, there was this idea that, we want that power. So there was this fight. There were many rulers in this short 20-year time. And so 1 month went by, and these conspirators took over. And some say that the king that we're introduced to in chapter 5, verse 1, King Belshazzar, was part of that conspiracy to take over. So we don't know for sure, but that's how the reign of that happened after Nebuchadnezzar was gone. You will also notice in verses 2 and verse 18 that Belshazzar refers to Nebuchadnezzar as father. Don't let that confuse you. I just told you the progression of how historically it went. That term father actually can be interpreted as ancestor or predecessor. And so that's what you need to, when we read that, that's the word that should come to mind, not actual biological father. In between chapters 4 and 5, there's a 20-year gap, roughly 20-year gap. And in case that throws you off a little bit, remember, Daniel is not a detailed historical account of the life of Daniel or of Nebuchadnezzar or anything like that. The intention of the book of Daniel in these passages is to tell about God's sovereignty and the fact that God has a plan that's always being accomplished no matter what is going on in the world. So it's not a detailed history book. You might wonder how old Daniel is at this point because we followed him since he was a teenager, exiled from his own country. He's about 80 years old now. He's in his 80s as we read today. So as we begin this historical account from Daniel chapter 5, I want you to keep in mind one other thing. Everyone was fighting for the throne in Babylon, for the power, including outsiders. The Persian army was attacking. We know that this chapter 5 is basically the final day of King Belshazzar's life. Prior to this, there had been attacks on the empire of Babylon for the power. There was war going on. And so the Persian army had been attacking the city and places outside of the city. So remember that because that'll be an important detail coming up. So what I want to do is I want to break this down into a few sections. The first section that I want you to focus on is verses 1 through 4. And I want you to see that King Belshazzar, the one we're introduced to, he threw a great feast for thousands of his lords. But this feast was not just a party. This was actually the king's party of mockery, is what I call it in your notes. The king's party of mockery. It tells us that there was this great party for thousands of lords, but the style of party that it was not wholesome. There were women, there was drinking, there was profanity, there was debauchery, and more. Anything that you can imagine in a huge, worldly, sin-filled party was present at this party. This was not like a formal dinner party at Downton Abbey. Okay, this was not with this nice, quiet, reserved group of people with servants. It was intended to be this big, rambunctious, disgusting party. That's what the king was doing. And he was doing this while ignoring the reality of what was happening to his kingdom around him. The Persian army is attacking. Let's close our minds off from all of the danger, all of the other things, and let's pretend like everything is just fine, let's have a party. And let's add as many distractions as we can to that party so that I forget about all of the other things. So we see this feast for 1,000 of his lords. And then he gets caught up in the excitement of this party, and his decisions are not becoming wiser and wiser, because he says, I am commanding my people to get the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple and be brought out so that we could drink from them. He didn't need extra vessels to drink from. I'm pretty sure they were accomplishing that in excess. But what this was this idea that I'm in charge, nothing is set apart as sacred because I, Belshazzar, am the king. And now let's get these holy relics from the temple that were taken and let's drink from them. Let's make them part of this sinful behavior. That's what's happening. He's making a mockery of the Lord. He's caught up in the moment, but as a standard in his life, he doesn't honor God. And it comes out in his actions, and he's making a mockery of the Lord. If you were reading here and you read verse 2, and then you read verse 3, you might have this idea that, wait, they just repeated and copied and pasted verse 2 and 3. They're very, very similar. If you took a moment and read it right now, you would say, those are almost identical verses. Why are they repeating the exact same information? Well, I like to think of that as a time for the reader to really focus on what's going on here. I read it once, and then I just read it again. What is the point in this? Why is this so important that they would have to read that or write that twice about the vessels being brought out from the temple and us drinking from them or them drinking from them? It's because it shows us the true heart of Belshazzar. This wasn't just a moment of caught up in the wine or caught up in a drunken moment. This was the cry of his heart to dishonor and make a mockery of the Lord. And you see this in verse 4 because it tells us that they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Basically, they had an extensive list of anything else that they could possibly worship, and they worshiped that, and they completely ignored God Most High, the very Most High God that Nebuchadnezzar had turned to before his death. And so we see these temple vessels are defiled with profane uses, including honoring false gods. He's making a mockery of God with this party. God is being dishonored and disregarded and mocked. And as the Most High God, he's not going to be ignored. He demands worship based on who he is and what he has done. And so guess what? He intervenes in this party. He intervenes, and this time the way that he intervenes is in an obvious yet terrifying way. And I call this next section in verses 5 through 9, the hand that causes trembling. Because in the midst of this big party, in the midst of all of this chaos, all of these bad decisions, we're having a great time, as they would probably define it. Look at verse 5. As an interruption to this party, immediately, the fingers of a hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now, before you let your mind wander too far, and you might excuse this as a vision or an imagination of a drunk king at a party, that's not what's happening. This is the direct, physical intervening of God himself. This is terrifying. I mean, can you imagine right now if all of a sudden a hand literally appeared and was writing things on that screen? You'd be trembling. The hand of God intervenes and says, I will not be mocked. I will not be ignored. I am the Most High God, and you have to recognize and honor me. So he intervenes. And it's terrifying. If you read verse 6, the king's reaction, it says, his color changed, his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together, literally shaking in his kingly boots. And you would do the same. I'm sure you would do the same. You would not have this positive reaction and go shake that hand. You would run away. You would shake. It literally says his knees knocked together, his color changed, even to the point that the queen recognized the change in his color. Because in verse 9, it actually shows us that his color changes again when no one can interpret this dream or interpret this handwriting. He doesn't know what to do with himself. This is such a crazy thing that just happened, and it's so real because it was real. It was the intervening of God. God intervened in his life to correct him and show him his sin. And when I think about that, when I think about the Most High God, holy, righteous, intervening in my life to identify and show me my sin, as I compare my sin to a holy God, I should be terrified. God can't be ignored. He won't be ignored. There is judgment, and that's what this warning is. It should make us shake that our sin is repulsive to a holy God. It makes us not acceptable in his presence. God intervenes and he shows that to Belshazzar. And so as expected, as was the way, I have to figure out what this means, Belshazzar thinks. So he calls on all of his wonderful mystics and magicians and interpreters in all of the kingdom in verse 8, and he's trying to find out what the words that were written mean. He even promised that if anyone can tell me what happened, I will clothe you in purple, I will put gold chains around your neck, and I will make you the third ruler in all of the land, in verse 7. So he's promising prestige. He needs an answer. Because I think he knows what's actually going on here. He's confronted, and he wants some other explanation. He wants to be at peace, but there's not going to be peace. So he looks for an interpretation. No one can do it. His color changes again because he's shocked. What does this mean? I want someone to tell me that this means something beneficial to me, but I'm starting to wonder, is there no one that can help me? And the queen reminds him in verses 10 through 28. We see the queen reminding the king of Daniel. And then we see Daniel coming in and interpreting the dream or the hand, the words on the wall. And what I call this passage or this section is the confrontation of pride and the promise of judgment. Because while the queen reminds Belshazzar of Daniel, someone in the kingdom can interpret the meaning, and they call for Daniel. But I want you to look at verse 11. They actually describe Daniel not as someone who serves the Most High God. So all of these other interpreters that worshiped other gods couldn't do it. But maybe Daniel, because he worships God himself, can do it. That's not what they said about Daniel in verse 11. It says he is filled with the spirit of the gods. So they're still trying to give credit to all of these false gods that they worship. Daniel can do it because he's a son of the Most High, or the gods. The spirit of the gods lives in him. They're wrong in their assessment. And Daniel comes in and makes sure that the direction of worship is in the proper place. He makes sure that he comes in and doesn't support them in their thoughts that it's just the spirit of the small g gods that he worships. It is the Most High God that he worships. So he accepts them by saying, I will interpret this for you. But he also says something interesting in verse 17. He says, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. I don't need the purple clothing. I don't need the chains. I don't need to be prestigious or powerful or anything else. He makes sure that he maintains the integrity for why he's doing what he's doing. It's not for gifts. It's not for any of those things that Belshazzar promised. It's for glorifying God, period. I'll interpret your dream. I'll interpret the handwriting on the wall if God gets credit. And so he proclaims who God is. Through Daniel, God confronts the pride of Belshazzar and demonstrates that there's going to be judgment happening. Because a holy God confronts anything that opposes him. That's what's happening here. There's sin, there's pride, there's mockery, there's all kinds of a list of things we could keep going on, and God confronts it. Anything that opposes him, he will confront and he will be victorious over. That's what these words on the wall mean, and we'll get there in a moment. But first, I want to read to you the passage of verses 18 through 28. If you would like to stand as we read to honor God's word, you are welcome to do that. But as we read God's word, honor him with your heart and the attention he deserves. Starting in verse 18, O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you have your lords, your wives, your concubines. They've drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hands is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored that God. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. These are the words that were written on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. This is the interpretation of those words of this matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. You may be seated. So I wanted to read all of that so that you saw the reminder of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. That even though Nebuchadnezzar spent time rejecting God, turning away from God, making bad decisions, ultimately he humbled himself before the Most High God, and he was restored before death. But we saw from that passage, Belshazzar has not humbled himself before God. He has not honored God in any way, and we're going to see judgment. But I want you to focus one moment on what Daniel did. He starts by giving credit to God. Before he explains what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, the Most High God did this. It's always about the glory of God. Always. Even though the Persian army is attacking, even though Daniel has the potential to be put higher up in the kingdom and get riches and be prestigious, it doesn't matter because it's about glorifying God in every moment of life. He also had a chance right there to remind Belshazzar, you knew all of these things. You knew it and you still did wrong. How could you see the life of Nebuchadnezzar, your father, your predecessor, your ancestor? How could you see that and not care, not give credit to God? It's obvious, but yet you still are rejecting it, is what Daniel is saying. And the words on the wall are so clear. Belshazzar, your days are numbered. There is an end, and God is in charge of when that end happens. And you have been weighed in the balances, and you have failed. You have failed to recognize the Most High God, the one who is in charge of all of this. And so, your kingdom is divided, and you are done. And so what we see in verses 29 through 31 is the justice of God. We see that Daniel receives the purple clothing, the chains, but I think it's just kind of a moot point because he knows the end is right there. He doesn't take the honor because he wants the prestige. I think it was just the formality of the celebration. And it's actually kind of interesting because as I was doing some research and digging, I found a picture of Daniel clothed in purple, wearing gold chains. It's actually quite amazing. It's right here. For those of you who aren't football fans, it's our hero, Kirk Cousins. He's been celebrating recently with road wins, and all of the team puts their chains around his neck, and the purple robe, I think, is photoshopped. I can't really tell. That's what Daniel might have looked like, clothed in purple, wearing tons of jewelry. But it wasn't for the prestige. He was still honoring God with this. Basically, this was a formality that suddenly, abruptly, the king is gone. God's justice is serious. We see in verses 30 and 31 that very night, Belshazzar is gone. He's killed. We don't know how from Scripture, and it doesn't really matter. It means that the end can come at any moment. That suddenly, abruptly, the end can happen. The days are numbered, and they're numbered by God. Belshazzar, for him specifically, the end was right then. He ran out of time to honor and recognize the Most High God. For us, none of us have any idea when the end is coming. We don't know when Jesus is returning. We don't know when each individual is going to meet their end, but we do know that the justice and judgment of God is final, and it's very serious. It should cause us to tremble. And before we get to the good news, I want us to dwell in this horrible reality for a moment. And I want to ask, what can we learn from this story? Because we just got to the end of chapter 5 quite abruptly, that the king is dead. And none of the earthly treasures mattered. None of the kingdom that he built for himself was forever. You remember the traditional greeting for Nebuchadnezzar was, "O king, live forever." Well, he didn't. And neither did Belshazzar, and neither did the kingdom that he built. It fell apart. And neither did any of the treasures. All of them were useless.